Wadsworth here. This week, our 14-2 Minnesota Vikings travel to Motown, Detroit Rock City, to take on Dan Campbell, Jared Goff, and the perfidious Detroit Lions. Who will come out on top? We'll find out. Stakes can't be any higher than this. Vikings, Lions for the number one seed and home field advantage and the NFC North Division Championship. As always, we do our big board. Start out with quarterback, finish with intangibles. Drew, why don't you start it off with the quarterback category this evening?
I don't really know. We got two quarterbacks here that have pretty much even seasons.
Yeah.
You look at the stat line right across the board, it's pretty much even all the way. Both are in really nice command of their offense. Both know their players really well and their tendencies and their strong points. The first meeting, I think the difference in that game was Goff. He only had 3 incompletions from what Chris told me before we started recording tonight. I did not know that. It would be tough to give one over the other. If I'm forced to do it, I would have to give it to the home field quarterback, Jared Goff. It's basically flip a coin for me. So I'm gonna give Goff the edge on this, even though I want Darnold to win the game and have a better game. It's hard to pick against Goff and when he's at home with this offense this year.
Kind of exactly my thought on the whole thing. Jared Goff, when he played the Vikings the first time in October, he was on a streak that was 22 of 25 or whatever it was in that first game against the Vikings. And he started off games going 14 of 14, 17 of 17, 20 of 21. It was just insane. He's fallen off of that pace a little bit, but he's still an exceptional quarterback. And that's not taking anything away from Sam Darnold. He's had a great year as well. If it was at home, I think I might give the edge to Darnold, but I'm going to give a slight edge to Detroit here. Chris?
All right, well, I started off the season picking against Sam Darnold at basically every opportunity in this category, and I'm going to end the season by throwing my full support and check mark here behind Sammy Darts. These last 5 weeks, dude has just been on a tremendous heater for the most part. I mean, since that ugly game at Jacksonville, he's thrown 2 interceptions, and one of them was on a 4th down. It really didn't matter. So he's thrown 1 meaningful interception in about 2 months. Just the way Kevin O'Connell has this offense running at this point, he is just so in command of everything. This is going to be the cherry on top of the sundae for the Sam Darnold redemption story, at least in the regular season, because I know the crowd in Detroit is going to be just unhinged and whatnot, but we're going to get to it later. This is not the same Detroit Lions defense that we saw at US Bank Stadium 2.5 months ago or whatever it was. So I think the Vikings offense has gotten much better since the first meeting between these two teams, and Detroit's defense has dropped off a bit, as we saw on Monday night against a San Francisco team that was playing really nobody of consequence at that point. So, yeah, I'm going to lean Sam Darnold with my quarterback check mark this week.
Okay. All right. Running game. The last time the Vikings faced the Lions, they had Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Arguably, maybe unquestionably, the best running back combo in the NFL. Since that meeting, David Montgomery suffered a season-ending injury, and he's been replaced by Craig Reynolds, who's not bad in his own right, but it's not Montgomery and Gibbs. That said, I mean, the Lions are still, 6th in the NFL in rushing yards per game, 144. Jahmyr Gibbs has taken on the role of typical workhorse running back very well. Compare that with Aaron Jones and Cam Akers for the Vikings. It seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but the Vikings running game has just sputtered a little bit in recent weeks. They start out strong, and then they just do not consistently maintain those really strong first and second down runs as the game progresses, which I think they have to do on Sunday night against the Lions. They have an opportunity to do that. If you watch that game, that Lions 49ers game, that Lions defense just is not what it was back in October. That said, I think I'm still going to give the edge to Detroit. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is one of the top 2 or 3 running backs in the NFL. I'm going to go with Detroit here. Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree with you on this one. I know not having Montgomery is pretty huge for Detroit, but Aaron Jones is kind of dinged up. He's got some sort of quad issue that kept him out of the end of the Packers game, so he may or may not be 100%. He says he's going to play, so whether he plays or not, he's probably not going to be 100%. The way Detroit blocks in the running game is pretty significant as well. I know the Vikings have been really good against the run this year, except for the 2 games they lost. The game against Detroit, they look pretty bad. The game against the Rams, they look pretty bad against the run. Yeah, all things stacking up the way they are, I think Detroit gets the check mark here on the running back and the running game side.
Drewster.
Gibbs. That's what it all comes down to for this game. Gibbs, besides Aiden Hutchinson, that might be the best draft pick they've had in the last few years is Gibbs. I've seen him play quite a bit this year because, the Lions are on quite a bit. So you get to see their offense, and he is the offense. I mean, people want to talk about the wild passing game and Goff, and it doesn't get started unless Gibbs gets started. You got a good thing going, Chris, Ted, when other teams know if they stop that issue, that part of your game, they have a chance to beat you, and teams can't stop him. That's when you got something good going on. Gibbs, last 4 games, we're going to go total touches here. 83, 504 yards, and 5 touchdowns between receiving, rushing. They still have the best offensive line in football, and you could say everything you want about the injuries, but 90% of Detroit's injury problems is on the other side of the ball. The best way to control Gibbs is to make Detroit have to throw the ball being behind. That's how they get him out of the game. Not by controlling how he runs. Have him be so far behind they have to pass it every down. That's how you're going to get away from Gibbs. But I would have to give the check mark still to Detroit when you factor in the offensive lines, and nobody's really shut Gibbs down. The other guy being out hasn't really mattered much, has it? I mean, Detroit's still running completely through Gibbs, and he's going to be the deciding factor against the Vikings front 7 this week is Gibbs. But I have to give them the check mark on the run game. The Vikings are, like Ted said, they're still a little iffy. You're not really sure what you're going to get. I do like the Vikings backs, but with that offensive line, how do you not give the running check mark to the Lions? I mean, I hate to do it, but
yeah. All right, receiving game. Chris, we'll start off with you.
I know the Lions have an impressive assortment of pass catchers. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, guys like that. I've never been super impressed with Jameson Williams, but I guess he has his moments here and there. But if you look at the Vikings receiving core and what they've done over these past few weeks, not just Justin Jefferson, who is going to get his regardless, but the tear that Jordan Addison has been on over the past few weeks, Jalen Naylor's even working things into the offense a little bit. And there's a guy who didn't play the first time these two teams met up that I think is going to be a huge factor in this one, and that is former Lion, TJ Hawkinson. We were hoping he would come back in time for the first Lions game, but he didn't. He is back now, and it seems like every time Sam Darnold needs to find a big connection on third down, Hawkinson's there for it. What we saw with what George Kittle did against the Lions on Monday Night Football, I don't know how much shot they have of slowing Hawkinson down with all the defensive issues they have. So, yeah, I'm going to give this one to the Vikings, and it's not as close as some might think it might be.
Drew, what about you?
I think player for player, I mean, they don't have a Jefferson, but I think player for player, these are 2 of the best receiving core teams in the league. This is where the defensive injuries come into play. I watched that rewatched that Niner game. Chris, Ted, there was like 3 Niner receivers running open every play. Purdy could have threw it wherever he wanted to. That is going to be a disaster for Detroit if they don't figure something out and you're going up against the Vikings receivers, who the last month or so, Chris, Darnold has proven he's going to throw it to whoever he wants. He's not picking on one guy. The Vikings should be able to just move up and down the field on that defense. And we're talking the secondary of the Lions, which we'll get to in a while. The problem is the linebacking core. Campbell had to move inside. He was a really good cover guy on the outside, but he had to move inside to take over Anzalone's spot. They can't cover shit in the middle of the field. Niners were Kittle was running laughing. He was so open. So the receivers are close. If you mention them right now, talented receivers across the board, tight end, Laporta and Hawkinson and Jameson Williams, all that. But when you factor in the secondary, the problem the Lions are having, you got to give the edge to the Viking receivers. And you can't take the edge away because each quarterback's good. Darnold good, Goff good. They're going to find the guy. The Lions have been able to mask this for about a month, but you only get away with it so long.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys said. If Brock Purdy doesn't throw those crippling interceptions, I think the 49ers win that game. You add in TJ Hawkinson, and I just think it's going to be a banner evening for the Vikings.
One last stat I want to throw in before we move on to the offensive line. Justin Jefferson has played 4 career games at Ford Field. Dude averages 182.5 yards receiving per game at Ford Field. 182 yards a game. I believe he's gone over 200 twice at Ford Field, including a couple years ago when he set the Vikings single game receiving record.
All right, offensive line. Drew, any chance you're picking the Vikings offensive line in this?
No. Lions have the best offensive line in football. They are healthy. Yeah. The Lions offensive line is also facing probably the top front seven they've had to face. Lots of disguises, lots of movement, lots of sub packages, lots of different players they have to prepare for. It's not just 2 or 3 guys. Vikings are subbing in different player after different player. If you ask me flat out, I got to pick one offensive line, it would have to be the Lions over the Vikings.
I agree. Player for player, I would maybe take Christian Darrisaw. I definitely would take Christian Darrisaw over Taylor Decker if Christian Darrisaw were healthy, but there's not another player on the Vikings offensive line when you look at them comparatively that I would pick over Detroit's Lions.
The Lions have the best offensive line in football. Minnesota has had the Darrisaw loss, but even if Darrisaw was still there, like you said, player for player, the Lions still have the better offensive line. So that's a pretty easy one for Detroit, I think.
Lions offense has been clicking. They're the number 1 scoring offense in the NFL. Vikings are top 10. They're 9th. But now let's move to the defensive side of the ball. Things are a lot different than when the Vikings played the Lions in U.S. Bank Stadium back in October. Of the front 7 guys that took the field for Detroit, they had just suffered Aiden Hutchinson's season-ending loss the week prior. I believe they'd played Dallas. Since then, they've lost another 5 dudes or 4 guys. I think they'd lost another linebacker. But basically, the only 2 players that the Vikings are seeing that started that game in October are DJ Reader, defensive tackle, and defensive end Josh Paschal. Drew, you already talked about Jack Campbell having to move from the outside to the inside as middle linebacker. They run a traditional 4-3. They acquired Zadarius Smith, former Viking, former Packer, and he really has kind of disappeared as he is sort of prone to do at the end of the year. This is a completely different defense. And if you watch that 49ers game, this is a defense that you can get a lot of yards on and a lot of points scored against if you don't turn the ball over. When you compare that to the Minnesota Vikings front 7, there was one huge player on the Vikings front 7 that did not play in that first Lions game, and that was Blake Cashman. And I think one of the reasons the Lions had as much success running the ball as they did was because Cashman was out. When Cashman plays, the Vikings are 13-0. When Cashman was out, they were 1-2. Blake Cashman makes a big difference in the Vikings defense. And I think had he played that first game, I think they would have won that game. But that's just me. It was a close game. Could have gone either way. Add in the fact that Dallas Turner is now starting to come on. He's had a couple of sacks. He's had that interception. He's starting to figure things out. I like the Vikings front 7 a lot better than the Lions here. Chris, what about you?
Absolutely. I'm in the same boat. You already talked about the Blake Cashman difference. I mean, that guy, he is the defensive MVP for the Vikings. I mean, even if you look at Jonathan Grenard, Andrew Van Ginkel, those guys have been spectacular, obviously, but Cashman is probably the most valuable player on Minnesota's defense just for that reason. He's a difference maker. They don't lose when Blake Cashman's on the field. They haven't lost this season when Blake Cashman's on the field. You know, like you said, Dallas Turner is finally starting to get it, with Pat Jones probably down for this week. He's going to have an even bigger role, I'm assuming. Ivan Pace is back and healthy. Harrison Smith is back and healthy. The Vikings are about as healthy as you could hope to be on the defensive side of the ball going into Week 18 of the regular season. And that gives Brian Flores all the flexibility he wants to do basically whatever he wants to pull out of the bag. I'm sure he's been saving some stuff for this week. So the front 7, this is an easy one for Minnesota.
True.
We know the check mark. It gave check mark to the quarterback and the running back. We know what the Lions can do offensively. The front 7 of each of these teams, there's a big gap now with the depletion of the Lions having all these guys out. They got 18 guys on IR, and I think most of them are defensive players.
Yeah.
You take out Hutchison and Aleem McNeil. Those are their 2 best linemen. It's so depleted. The Vikings should kick their ass of the front 7 wise. I don't think it's even close. And you mentioned everything about Cashman. You know how I feel when I did my game football write-up after the game last week about Blake Cashman. If you read it, you know what I think about that guy. Figure in scheme, the health of the defense, it's not even close. The Vikings should be the disruptive team up front. I don't know how the Lions are going to deal with it, especially in their front 7 coming at us. Their linebackers, besides Campbell, Ted, are just You could call them D-League NBA guys. They're just bodies in there. Just what they've given up the last 4 weeks. 31, 48, 17, and 34. You can mask that with a lot of stuff, but you're going to run into a team that's going to, you got to do more than that.
And that 17 was against the Bears, so it really doesn't count because that Bears offense is terrible.
Vikings, check mark on the front seven by far.
All righty. Let's move to the secondary. Again, the only two guys that were there or that will be playing or projected to start this game that were there in October are Brian Branch and Terrion Arnold. And Brian Branch is now kind of designated as nickelback for the Lions, and he was their starting strong safety. So that's, again, another big bunch of changes for the Lions. Chris, why don't you go ahead and start us off with the secondary?
Yeah, I mean Branch and Joseph, as much as I can't stand Kirby Joseph, are solid safeties for the Lions. Outside of Terrion Arnold, I don't know who the hell any of their cornerbacks are. And when you're facing Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, that's probably bad. You're going to have to single cover one of those guys. You can't double both of them all the time, and either one of those guys is going to absolutely smoke whatever warm body the Lions are going to put out there on Sunday night, I would think. So the Vikings have had some issues in the secondary every so often, but for the most part, Byron Murphy has continued to play well. Shaq Griffin, Stephon Gilmore, now that he's back from the injury. And the Viking safeties are no slouches either. They're not Branch and Joseph level quite necessarily, but they're still pretty solid. But it's a close one just because of the play of Branch and Joseph, but I'm going to lean toward Minnesota on this one.
Drew.
I like the secondary for the Lions if you go player by player, but not in this game, I don't. Because the non-play of the linebackers for the Lions is really starting to hurt their secondary. And there's one thing I'll tell you what the Lions secondary does. They have good players. Every week you watch them play, there's a late hit. There's an unsportsmanlike conduct back there. There's all sorts of undisciplined guys that aren't following even what they're supposed to be doing as a role in the field. There's a lot of rogue playing going on back there, Chris. And going up against the Vikings, you can't have any of that. No. They're a grabby secondary, and when they start getting flagged, they start getting mad. They're going to have a late hit. There was a game a few weeks ago. Brian Branch had punched 3 different people and no calls on him. And I couldn't figure out what the problem was, but I'm going to give it to the Vikings because the Vikings secondary not only has talent and plays well, they got a better front seven putting pressure on the Lions offense. There's more opportunities for interceptions. And interceptions are part of both these teams' game. With 38 interceptions between the teams, I think is what the total is. That's crazy. The Vikings having 22 of those, but both teams can pick the ball up. But I'd be a lot more impressed to see the interception numbers they had when they had the full defensive line in there with McNeil and Hutchinson. Being the discipline of the Lions, they seem to fall apart penalty-wise. Good safety play, but if they can't cover the Niners wide receivers, Ted, how are they going to cover the Vikings?
Pearsall, yeah, that rookie receiver Pearsall for 49ers got behind the Lions guy that was covering him, I think, just about every time they threw to him.
Pearsall, Ted, that's not Lynn Swan.
He looked like Dan Abramowitz in the later stages of his career. My God. But nothing against Brian Branch and Kirby Joseph. I think Kirby Joseph's the dirtiest player in the league, but that's just me.
But they're good players. They're solid players.
They're very good players, and I think Joseph leads league in interceptions. That's the thing, and he had a sneaky good interception against Purdy. He hit his coverage very well. I think he had the interception that pretty much ended the game for the 49ers on Sunday night. But when you look at the injuries that have hit the Lions secondary and their front seven, I'm going to go with the Vikings on this one. Red zone, Drewster.
This is a push for me. I think both teams have equal talent in the red zone. I think the numbers are probably going to be, I haven't seen the numbers, but they seem that they would be similar to me. Both are probably around, top 10? Both offense and defense somewhere. Maybe the Vikings defense is a little lower or something. But I'm going to go push on this, and I think Detroit's going to have more pressure in the red zone because I'm telling you, they're the one that's going to be chased. Most teams chase the Lions offensively in every game. They chase the score. They're the ones that's going to be chasing us this week. So there's going to be high pressure in the red zone. They won't attempt one field goal, Ted. They'll go for every single 4th and 17 from the they're going to go for it. But I think I'm going to give just a push on this. I think both teams are equal on both sides of the ball.
I'm going to give the edge to Detroit here. Their offense is 3rd. Their defense is 12th. The Vikings is 10th in offense. Defense is 16th. Their skill guys, receiving skill guys are about equal. The edge, I think, here is Jahmyr Gibbs. He's a very strong runner. When you put that offensive line, especially when you talk about inside the 10 and you have to run the ball those last get inside the 5 and you have to run the ball those last 5 yards. I just think the Lions are a little bit stronger in the red zone. Although the Vikings defensively, they can bow up and put a goal line stand on you almost as good as anybody. But I'm going to give the edge to the Lions here. Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to have to agree. I think Gibbs is, like Ted said, Gibbs is the difference maker as far as red zone. Not that Aaron Jones and the rest of the Vikings backs can't get it done, but yeah, Gibbs just has that extra ability to find the end zone when he's called upon. The receivers are all solid in the red zone, but yeah, I think Detroit gets the check mark here. It's a slight one, but yeah, I think Gibbs makes just enough of a difference to tilt that in Detroit's direction.
All right, special teams. Will Reichard started off the year just aces. I don't know that I'm officially worried about him yet, but he is not as accurate as he was before his injury. He missed a couple kicks the week he went on IR, missed a kick the week he came off, seemed to settle down, and then he missed a couple, would have missed 3 field goals last week, had one not been nullified by a penalty, and then he got to redo it and made the kick. Jack Bates, solid kicker for Detroit. Jack Fox, solid punter. Ryan Wright's had a pretty good year, pretty good bounce back year from last year. All that said, I'm going to go with Detroit on the special teams here just because of Reichard's recent struggles. He's a good kicker. I think he'll bounce back. If it's going to start, it better start Sunday night. Chris?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Jake Bates has been nails, particularly at home for Detroit this year. Like you said, I'm not worried about Will Reichard yet. He needs to pick it up. I mean, he's missed 5 field goals. 3 of them have hit an upright. One of them hit the crossbar. So he's been accurate. He hasn't completely just blown very many kicks, but to get himself back to what he was doing before the injury, when he looked like he was just the second coming of Justin Tucker or something. So I will give Detroit a slight advantage here, but it's a whole lot closer to a push than it is to being a really one-sided advantage for Detroit.
Drew?
I'm going to give the Vikings a check mark on the special teams. I'm going to tell you why. Because I think Detroit's going to make a huge blunder on special teams this week. I think it's going to be a fumble on a punt or something, a penalty calling back a long return or something. I just think the Vikings are going to play better special team-wise, and I'm not worried about Will Reichard. If you want my opinion, I think Will Reichard's still a little dinged up. And I say that by, if you not just necessarily doinking field goals off the upright, watch him on the kickoff since he came back. He's not booming them out of the end zone anymore. And it looks a little different to me. His kickoffs seem like they don't have the power they once had. I think he's maybe still a little bothered with some kind of injury. I'm not trying to build in an excuse. That's just my opinion. He doesn't look 100%. So unless the kicker's 100%, I'm not going to judge him. This game's not going to come down to a kicker anyway because it's going to be 35-30 halfway through the third quarter. Field goals will be out the window. Teams are going to be going, this is going to be balls out all the way, balls to the walls. I don't think it's going to make a difference, but I think the Lions are going to make a huge mistake somewhere on special teams. I think the Vikings are going to take advantage of that. That's how they've been winning all season, is picking up on teams' little problems, and there's going to be something that happens in the special teams, and that's why I'm giving them the check mark this week.
Okay. Let's move to coaching. I know we all have a lot of opinions about the coaching staff for the Detroit Lions and the Minnesota Vikings. Chris, why don't you kick it off for us?
Kevin O'Connell is the National Football League Coach of the Year. If it's not unanimous, whoever's not voting for Kevin O'Connell needs to have their voting privileges revoked. This guy has a team looking at 15 wins that was projected to win about 6 games. And I know we bring it up pretty much every time we talk about the Lions coaching staff. Dan Campbell has a tendency to make a lot of stupid decisions. And eventually one of those stupid decisions is going to come back and bite his team in the ass. And I'm hoping that it's Sunday night. I mean, he had one the first time these two teams played with the fake punt fairly deep in their territory that the Vikings turned into a touchdown. He knows his defense is not going to do a whole lot of stopping the Vikings. They're going to try to get into a shootout with this team. So it seems like whenever Dan Campbell is involved in a game that's close down toward the end, he's the anti-Kevin O'Connell. He tightens up a little bit. Not like O'Connell, who's just, he's like, we're used to this kind of thing. We do this all the time. The Lions don't do this all the time. So, yeah, I mean, I think that I know Ben Johnson's a great offensive coordinator. He's hopefully going to be moving on to somewhere as a head coach after this season so that we don't have to deal with him. He doesn't have to cover for Dan Campbell anymore. But, yeah, I am going to give Kevin O'Connell the edge until someone just completely outcoaches him in a game because nobody's done it in about 2.5 months. And I don't see it starting on Sunday night. So Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings coaching staff gets a check mark here.
Drew?
The Vikings have the best coaching staff in the NFL. And if somebody wants to argue with me on that, go ahead and put it in the comments below. Talk to me on the live show. I went through all the coaching staffs and looked at them all. Name me a team that can win football games on both sides of the ball as well as the Vikings. Name one. Because the Vikings can do it from any angle. Overall, this game, we're looking at a possibility of 4 guys getting head coaching jobs next year. When you factor in Aaron Glenn, fantastic defensive coordinator, Johnson, then on our side of the ball, Wes Phillips probably isn't going to be a head coach, but Brian Flores, there's a lot of potential head coaches just playing in this game. I don't like Dan Campbell. I think he's on cocaine. I don't like his decision-making process. That guy looks wired off his ass.
Allegedly. We have to say allegedly.
I have seen a lot of whiffy-piffy heads in my day, Chris. I played a lot of rock and roll, and I've seen a lot of uppity, sniff. And that guy is on something. Watch him on the sidelines when the camera's on him. It'll work to our favor, though. But
allegedly.
He's gonna make another mistake because he gets his ego in the way. And like Ted said, he knows his defense is gonna be KY jelly. A lot of lubing going on. He knows he's gonna have to go for everything. He's gonna go for it 6 times in this game on 4th down. The Vikings have the best coaching staff, I'll say it again, in the National Football League. I'm giving the check mark to the Vikings for this game and for every damn rest of the 4 games we have remaining or whatever, Chris. Check mark. I don't trust Dan Campbell. I've never trusted anybody on
Allegedly.
That's probably good advice, not just in football, but in real life as well. We're teaching real life lessons here on Vikings. Never trust anybody on cocaine. Yes.
There's a difference between aggressive and reckless. When you take over a 2 or 3 win franchise, go for it on 4th down and 12 at your own 30 when you're 0-10. Nobody cares. But now that you've established and gotten rid of that loser culture that you were hired to do, and congratulations for doing it because Dan Campbell was the right guy to do that, you have to temper that aggression, ration thought, and winning games. He doesn't do that. It's paid off so far in the regular season, but now when you get to the playoffs, you're playing teams as good as you are. In the NFL playoffs, it comes down to coaching. And look, the Vikings have been in the playoffs for the better part of 3 weeks. Ever since they came off those 3 straight road games, they've been playing playoff games. They've had to keep pace with Detroit. They've had to. Say what you want about Kevin O'Connell's play calling sometimes and defense lapsing sometimes, but they don't make huge, blunderous coaching errors like Dan Campbell did against Buffalo, like he did against Minnesota that first game when Chris mentioned that fake punt deep in his own territory. And at some point, that is going to cost you. Last year, he made 2 or 3 really bad coaching decisions, not going for a field goal and going for it on 4th down that cost them potentially points and a shot at the Super Bowl. Like you said earlier, he can't get out of his way of his own ego. And he's going to keep doing that stuff. You keep doing that, and you keep putting this depleted and maybe it was fine when you had the defense that you had at the beginning of the season, but you don't have that defense now. You keep doing that, and teams, you give them a short field position like this Vikings offense, it's going to blow up in your face. I like the Vikings, but I will say I think Ben Johnson is probably the best overall coach that's on the field. His offense is just really creative, and I can't wait for him to get out of the NFC North and get a head coaching gig somewhere not in the NFC. So I only see him once every 5 years or whatever.
They're only a 10-win team without him.
Yeah, probably. Moving on to intangibles.